Civilisation Judas, Introduction. This book is essentially a revision of the history of Western civilization, particularly with regard to the religions of Judaism, Islam, and Christianity. It's quite a speculative work and should perhaps be considered as an ideas book. Though I present an alternative view of world history, I'm by no means presenting this as the definitive or correct version of history. In fact, as I state at times in the book, I don't really believe there ever can be any genuine sort of definitive history, only more or less probable scenarios and timelines, that we can only ever ascribe a likelihood to, a likelihood that to some degree will always be somewhat subjective to the person making it. I do, however, hope that the book presents some interesting and novel viewpoints, which readers will take value from. I should also mention that, as ever with opinions and viewpoints, especially viewpoints about religion or culture, there will no doubt be some in the book that people disagree with, or that even cause offense to some people. Though I don't mind people taking offense, it was never my intention when writing the book. So if you do take issue with anything written, please bear that in mind. Again, these are just ideas and opinions, so it's perfectly fine if you disagree with them, even strongly. However, it's important to remember the context. These are simply words on a page, an expression shared in the hope that it will add something of worth to the collective human conversation. Chapter 1. The Other Aristocracy. In this book, I'll be covering a broad range of topics, all of which in some way relate to the development of Western civilization and its underlying core tenets. I should probably start by explaining the title, though. It pertains to something I call archetypal Christianity, and alludes to my conjecture that the Jesus and Judas archetypes both have their roots, or at least some of their roots, in economic and political developments, as opposed to specifically religious ones. This may sound a little dry at first, but it actually offers a much more interesting and cohesive explanation for things. Economic forces are obviously a huge driving force in today's world, so it would be foolish to discount this influence when looking backwards. The Jesus and Judas archetypes can, in many ways, be viewed as symbolic representations of Christians and Jews in general. And it's with these stereotypes that I'll begin. I'll start with the Jewish stereotype. We tend to have a relatively fixed definition of the word Jew, though even now the label is very vague and often subjectively defined. However, I believe historically the term was much more loosely used, and I think its general sense originally just implied a member of a particular economic group in society. This will no doubt sound a little controversial to many people reading. However, I'll explain my reasons for this thinking below. It's a concept I refer to as the other aristocracy. It's this that links Jewishness with city life, and by extension civilization, the word civilization having its roots in the Latin civitas, meaning city. Hence the title of the book, Civilisation Judas. I can explain it as follows. Imagine at some distant point in the past, let's say the medieval period for argument's sake, and you have a bunch of lower class or common people living in a particular area. Now, over time, those people will largely remain lower class. However, some of these people, through their natural intelligence or craft, may rise up the social ladder. These people will likely be drawn more towards towns and cities, as city life offers more opportunity for employment and business, whereas in the countryside, roles are more traditional and fixed. The aristocracy own the land, and the peasants work it. So over time, in cities and towns, intelligence accrues towards the top end of civil society, as intelligent people take advantage of the social mobility it offers. This then results in two different types of aristocracy in wider society. One, the more commonly known landed aristocracy, a group or class we're all quite familiar with. The other, a city-based aristocracy, a not-so-familiar concept. Like the landed aristocracy, this city-based aristocracy tend to marry amongst themselves, that is, within their own social class, which then helps to forge and cement trade and family networks within towns and cities, and also between towns and cities. The core difference between the landed and city aristocracies can be summed up as such. The landed aristocracy are tied to their land and derive their wealth and status from it, with their power resting largely on tradition and force, the force needed to defend their territory, raise militias, maintain law and order, etc. However, the city aristocracy don't have vast areas of land. What they have is transferable wealth, money, gold, trade links, etc. Their power largely rests on innovation and intelligence. Unlike the landed aristocracy, they are not tied to the land, but are in a position to move, and to move their wealth as well. However, in contrast to the landed aristocracy, they also largely lack the force needed to defend themselves from violence, or to raise physical attacks upon others directly themselves. Thanks to these factors, the landed aristocracy tend to have an interest in maintaining the state and the status quo, whereas the city aristocracy tend to have a more internationalist outlook. These two forces at times come into conflict with one another, though at other times their interests overlap, the hoi polloi generally switching their allegiance between the two forces depending on which worldview seems to be offering the better prospect at the time. It's my general view that historians tend to overlook or even completely miss the importance of this city-based aristocracy. I think this may largely be due to the fact that most Western historians tend to look at history as a history of nations, a history that the deep and complex trading and cultural networks between international cities and towns doesn't fit neatly into. We tend to be given the following view of history. Nations interact with each other as nations at the international level. Then, within each nation, there is an aristocracy at the top, generally synonymous with the aforementioned landed aristocracy, a peasant or laboring class at the bottom, and a middle class of some description wedged in the middle between the two. Now, I believe this model to be a vast oversimplification, one that downplays the function of cities and towns, and that also fails to take into consideration how wealth, particularly transferable wealth, can aggregate within such urban areas. It also fails to consider the consequence of what happens when people or groups acquire such wealth, but because of social norms or the fixity of wider traditional society, can't acquire large tracts of land to become part of the landed aristocracy themselves. It's in this city aristocracy sense that I believe the label Jew was often used throughout history, and that such conflicts between Jews and the wider populations of their host countries stemmed from this interplay between city and country. In fact, on the topic of transferable wealth, it's interesting to note that the root of the word jewelry, wealth literally carried around on the body, is Jew. There are also other English words associated with city-based professions that would perhaps suggest some kind of Jewish provenance. Jury, of course, associated with legal proceedings. Due or duty, meaning tax. Words like judge, judicial, etc. We also have the Temple area of London, one of the main legal districts and a noted centre for English law. Now, at this point, anyone reading may be feeling a little confused. Is not Jewishness entwined with the history of the Jewish religion? Did not the European Jews arrive in Europe from the Middle East? Though I don't discount that these statements are somewhat true, in fact, it's something we'll be returning to later in the book, my general view is something quite different. I believe that what we think of as Jewishness is something that emerges from within our culture, rather than something that arrives from somewhere foreign to it. I believe that the above-described city aristocracy process is the driving force behind this, and that, although we tend to view Jewishness predominantly as a religious or racial phenomena, originally it was actually a social and economic one. I believe that the religious and ethnic traditions grew out of this rather than the other way round. In my next chapter, I'll explain what led me to first explore these thoughts.